They called the police to remove me from my own land, until the truth exposed that I owned everything they tried to control. I bought the land 2 years ago, 10 acres of untouched hillside overlooking a peaceful valley. No neighbors, no noise, and definitely no HOA. Or so I thought. One morning I found a small group of people wandering around the edge of my property, acting like they owned the place. They were pointing, measuring, and arguing about community borders. I stepped out, confused. "What are you doing on my land?" A woman with a clipboard smirked. "We're from the Ridgeview HOA. These plots belong to us now." That was the moment I realized they had no boundaries, literally or legally. So I put up a large warning sign: private property. Trespassing will be PROSSUTDI had no idea that one sign would set off a war. 2 days later, I heard loud footsteps near my fence. Heavy, dramatic stomping like someone trying to announce their authority through gravity alone. I looked out the kitchen window and of course there she was. The HOA president, Karen, queen of complaints, destroyer of peace, and self-appointed ruler of anything within a 10-mile radius. She stood there with her clipboard like it was a royal scepter, chin lifted so high I thought she might topple backwards. She marched straight up to the warning sign I'd put on my own land. A simple, reasonable sign that literally just said, "Private property." Do not acted as if it were some kind of personal attack on her legacy. She snapped a photo with the aggression of someone trying to break their phone screen with sheer indignation. Then she turned and glared at me. Not a normal glare. No, this was the kind of glare reserved for people who forget to use a coaster on her coffee table. "This sign violates HOA regulations," she barked, voice sharp enough to peel paint. I walked outside slowly, coffee mug in hand, more amused than offended. "I'm not in your HOA," I said casually. "You'd think I told her gravity had been canceled." Karen's eyes widened like I'd slapped her across the face with a stack of bylaws. Her jaw dropped slightly, and then she gathered herself like a villain in a soap opera. "You are in Ridgeview," she announced, pointing the clipboard at me like a sword. "You simply don't know it yet." That last line she delivered with such dramatic flair it sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in front of the mirror. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Karen," I said calmly, "this land has been in my family for generations. Your HOA doesn't extend past the creek." She stiffened. "It does now." "It doesn't. We voted." "I don't care," she gasped like I had just committed treason. Karen took another picture of the sign, then another picture of me, then another of the fence, and then she wrote something on her clipboard with furious little stabs of her pen. I could practically hear her handwriting screaming. "You'll be hearing from us," she declared. "I look forward to not responding," I said. I turned around and headed back toward my house before I said something I'd regret, or worse, something she'd try to file a complaint about. But as I reached my porch, I felt that familiar Karen shiver crawl up my spine, because Karen wasn't done, not even close. She stood there at the fence, muttering to herself like a villain making a monologue only she could hear. I could hear snippets though: uncooperative, mandatory compliance, willful obstruction, review board, and the always mysterious "that'll show him." She even paced like she was planning a tactical invasion. She measured the fence with her eyes. She examined the land like she was preparing an architectural critique. At one point she crouched down, pressed her face nearly against the dirt, took another photo, then stood up and sniffed like something personally offended her nose. Then she pointed at my house like she was putting a curse on it. I didn't even bother hiding my laughter. I walked inside and shut the door, but through the window I could still see her marching back and forth like a malfunctioning Roomba. After about 5 minutes of theatrical packing, she stomped away, typing furiously into her phone with the force of someone sending a strongly worded letter to customer support. I thought that would be the end of it. A complaint here, a threatening letter there, maybe a passive-aggressive flyer stuffed into my mailbox. I underestimated her, greatly, because less than an hour later I heard the sound of a car rolling to a stop, slow, official, intentional. I peeked out the window. Karen was back. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood another woman, clipboard, badge, lanyard, the whole uniform of neighborhood enforcement. Karen was explaining something with hand gestures so dramatic she could have been conducting an orchestra. The other woman nodded, then looked at my house with a mixture of confusion and concern, like Karen had dragged her into a situation she was not paid enough to understand. Karen stormed up to the sign again, pointed at it, then pointed at the ground, then pointed at my house, as if she were presenting evidence at a war tribunal. The new woman took a few photos too, but with far less rage, more like she was documenting Karen's meltdown in case she needed proof later. I walked onto the porch again just to see what fresh madness was happening now. Karen spun around like a villain caught mid-scheme. "Good," she snapped. "You're here. We are conducting an official Ridgeview compliance inspection. On land that isn't yours," I asked. "On land that is yours," she corrected, "but should be ours." "That's not how land works, Karen. It is now." She smiled in a way that made me want to check my property lines again, even though I knew I was right. I set my coffee down. "What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" She lifted her clipboard dramatically. "You will remove that sign, file the appropriate paperwork, submit to HOA jurisdiction, and agree to ongoing compliance inspections." "No," I said. "You don't have a choice," she declared. "I always have a choice," I said, "and that choice is no." Karen's nostrils flared like an angry horse preparing for battle. She scribbled something so aggressively that her pen broke, literally snapped. Ink splattered onto her clipboard. The other woman stepped slightly away from her like she didn't want to get hit by flying Karen debris. Karen glared at me with a fury that could power small cities. Then she said the words that made my stomach drop, not out of fear, but because I knew exactly what kind of trouble she was capable of. "Then we'll escalate," she whispered. And with that, she marched away. The other woman gave me an apologetic shrug before following her. I watched them disappear down the road, and that Karen shiver crawled up my spine again, stronger this time. Because whatever escalate meant in Karen language, it was going to be dramatic, annoying, and very, very loud. And she wasn't done. Not even close. The next morning, before I even had coffee in my system, I heard voices outside, multiple voices, walkie-talkies crackling, the sound of people rustling around where no one should be. I stepped onto my porch and nearly choked. 4 HOA board members were standing on my land, marching around with clipboards and neon vests like they were conducting a government operation. They looked like low-budget FBI agents who had gotten their training from YouTube tutorials. One guy even had aviator sunglasses on at 7 in the morning, acting like the sun personally hired him to be its bodyguard. They were sticking tiny colored flags into the ground every few feet, muttering into their walkie-talkies like, "Section B marked," and advancing to grid point 3, as if my property had suddenly become a military zone. I walked toward them slowly, trying to figure out how people became this level of delusional. Before I even reached them, the tallest guy, a man built like a broomstick with a dad-bod belly, held up his hand and said, "Sir, you need to stay behind the line for safety." "What line?" I asked. He pointed dramatically to a row of pink flags they had planted 2 minutes earlier on my land. "This one," he said. "We're adjusting your property lines." I blinked. "Your what?" He cleared his throat like he was giving a lecture in court. "Your property line has been expanded into HOA jurisdiction. We are marking the correct borders." "Correct borders?" I repeated. "Yes," he said confidently. "Correct." I stared at them, waiting for one of them to laugh or smile or show any sign this was a prank. Instead, they nodded at each other like they had solved world hunger. Karen stood behind them, arms crossed, a smug smile plastered across her face like she'd painted it on that morning. "Good," she barked. "Continue marking the perimeter. We need accurate measurements before filing our violation report." One of the board members replied, "Copy that," into his walkie-talkie, even though the person he was talking to was standing 2 feet away. I couldn't take it anymore. "You can't just redraw my land," I said, trying very hard not to laugh. Karen snapped her head toward me like a hawk spotting prey. "We have authority here," she said with the confidence of someone who had memorized the bylaws instead of the Constitution. "You're out of compliance." "Compliance with what?" I asked. "HOA Regulation 14B, she said. "Unauthorized signage, unauthorized fencing, and failure to register property modifications." "This isn't your property," I reminded her. "I'm not part of your HOA. You are now, she said. The board voted. That's not how any of this works. Karen marched toward me, heels stabbing into the dirt like she was punishing the ground. If you refuse to comply, she said dramatically, we will escalate. I sighed, reached into my back pocket and pulled out my property deed, the official, signed, stamped, county-recorded deed showing all 10 acres legally belonging to me. I handed it to her. She snatched it like it offended her personally. She glanced at it with the enthusiasm of someone reading a stranger's grocery receipt. Her eyes flicked across the lines, but it was painfully obvious she didn't understand half of what she was looking at. She held the deed like it was written in ancient Martian. Then, without even finishing, she shoved it back into my hand. This means nothing, she said. I raised an eyebrow. It means I own this land. It means nothing, she repeated louder as if volume could change property laws. The HOA map overrides whatever old document you have. Old document, I asked. It's 5 years old. Irrelevant, Karen snapped. Property lines are fluid when new regulations are introduced. No, I said flatly, they're not. One of the board members walked up and said, perimeter recalculated. We've shifted his property boundary east by 12 feet. Another board member chimed in, and south by 8. Perfect, Karen said proudly. This will make enforcement easier. I stared at them in disbelief. You're moving my property line like it's a couch. Karen smirked. We're correcting it. No, I said again. You're trespassing, she scoffed. It's not trespassing if it's under HOA review. Karen, I said, your HOA didn't exist on this side of the creek until you printed your little map yesterday. Progress requires expansion, she said. We voted. Let me guess, I said, just the 4 of you. 5, she corrected proudly. Todd was on Zoom. The 4 board members nodded like this somehow made everything legitimate. Karen lifted her chin. We'll get law enforcement involved, she declared. This situation is beyond your control now. Law enforcement, I repeated. Yes, she said, puffing up her chest. We will inform them that you are refusing compliance with Ridgeview HOA jurisdiction. I smiled slowly, deliberately, the kind of smile that made Karen's eyes narrow in suspicion. Please do, I said. She blinked. What? Call them, I said. Call the police, deputies, sheriff, whoever you want. She hesitated, just for a second. We will, she said, regaining her fake authority. Good, I replied. Because I'd love to watch you explain to actual law enforcement why you and your survey team are standing on land that legally belongs to me. Her jaw tightened. The board members shifted nervously. One of them whispered, Karen, are we allowed to be here? She hissed back, quiet, John, we're establishing dominance. I nearly choked. Establishing dominance. Like this was a wildlife documentary. Karen lifted her walkie-talkie with the seriousness of a general preparing for war. Team, she said, finish marking the borders, then we file the violation report. I crossed my arms. You do that. She glared at me, furious that I wasn't panicking. I kept smiling. Go on, I added, make the call. And the moment I said that, I saw it, just the tiniest flicker of doubt in her eyes, because deep down, Karen knew something very important. She wasn't just wrong. She was catastrophically wrong. And law enforcement was going to make that very, very clear. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched long across my yard, I heard the unmistakable rumble of engines, deep, official, heavy. 2 police cruisers rolled up my driveway with their lights flashing, radios crackling, and an energy that suggested someone had called in the crime of the century. I walked outside slowly, already knowing who had summoned them but still hopping, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, it was something normal. No such luck. One officer stepped out, adjusting his belt like he was preparing for paperwork rather than danger. Sir, he said cautiously, we received a call saying you're trespassing on HOA property. I blinked. Hard. Trespassing, I repeated. I lifted my hand and pointed at my house. You mean my house, the one I built, on my land that I bought, with my deed, and my money? The officer's expression shifted from formal to confused to exhausted in about 3 seconds. He looked at his partner, then back at me, clearly realizing the call was not what dispatch made it sound like. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed from the road, sharp, fast, theatrical footsteps, like someone trying very hard to make an entrance. And then she appeared. Karen. She marched out from behind the cruisers like she was leading a SWAT operation, chin high, clipboard raised, hair sprayed into a helmet of determination. She pointed directly at me and shouted, "Arrest him. He's violating HOA codes and harassing board members." One officer actually turned around to look behind him as if she must be yelling at someone else. When he realized she wasn't joking, he sighed, a long, soul-drained sigh that said he had dealt with this woman before and would probably have to deal with her again. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we need to confirm ownership before anything else." "Ownership?" she repeated, horrified. "He is defying the Ridgeview HOA. That is a crime." The officer blinked. "No," he said slowly, "it is." Karen thrust her chin forward. "It should be." I pulled the deed from my back pocket again and handed it to the officer. He took it, stepped aside, and began reading through it like a man who already knew the answer but wanted to be thorough. Meanwhile, Karen scrambled to shove her own stack of papers at him. HOA bylaws clearly printed from the internet an hour earlier, the ink still slightly shiny. "These are the regulations he's violating," she yelled, pushing the papers toward his chest. The officer didn't even reach for them. They slid off his vest and fluttered to the ground like a sad snowfall of nonsense. "Ma'am," he said patiently, "we're talking about land ownership, not HOA rules." "HOA rules are law," she screeched. "No," the officer said again, slower this time. "They're not," she gasped like he had struck her. The officer finished reviewing my deed, handed it back with a polite nod, and said the words I knew were coming but Karen definitely wasn't ready for. "This land belongs to him." Karen's jaw dropped so far I thought it might unhinge. "No," she shrieked. "He's manipulating you." The officer stared at her with the calm, exhausted eyes of a man who had survived too many HOA disputes and wanted nothing more than to go home and eat dinner. "Ma'am," he said, rubbing his forehead, "this is not HOA jurisdiction." Karen's face turned a shade of red normally reserved for malfunctioning warning sirens. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak but couldn't find a single word that made sense. Her board members, who had been hiding behind the patrol cars like guilty children, peeked around the edges, waiting to see if Karen's delusion would somehow be validated. It was. But your map is wrong," she sputtered. "HOA expanded last year." "No, it didn't," the officer replied calmly. "Yes, it did. Ma'am, the county has no record of any expansion." Karen pointed wildly at the ground. "We added new borders." "You can't do that," the officer said. "We voted," she shouted, as if that settled everything. "You can't vote to take someone's private property," he replied, sounding like a teacher explaining basic math to a student who insisted 2 + 2 was 17. Karen stomped closer to him. "You don't understand. He's been non-compliant since the moment he moved here." "He moved here 12 years ago," I said calmly. "Your HOA was formed 5 years ago." That shut her up for maybe half a second. Then she hissed, "Irrelevant." The officer exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, you called in a false police report." "It wasn't false," she insisted. "He is trespassing." She jabbed her finger at my lawn like she was revealing a battlefield. The officer turned, planted his boots on the ground deliberately and said, "This ground is legally his." Karen froze completely, like someone had unplugged her software. Then she whispered, "But he doesn't follow the codes." "HOA codes," the officer said gently, "are not enforceable by police." "They should be," she snapped. "They aren't," he said. "They should be." "They are." This continued for 3 painful back-and-forth cycles until finally the officer held up his hand. "Ma'am, enough." Karen's face twitched, her nostrils flared. Her fists clenched around her clipboard like she wanted to throw it but feared the HOA bylaws might explode upon impact. The officer took a step toward her. "If you continue to harass this homeowner or trespass on his property, you may be charged." Karen staggered backward, scandalized. "Me? Charged?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You." The other officer chimed in, "And your board members, too." All 4 of them stiffened like mannequins caught doing something illegal in a storefront window. Karen tried to recover. "This is abuse of power," she declared. "This is harassment. This is the end of this call," the officer interrupted. "Go home." Karen sputtered like an overheated engine. You haven't heard the last of this." "I'm sure we will," the officer said dryly. Karen whirled around dramatically, almost tripping over her own dropped papers, and stormed off down the driveway like a furious parade float. The board members scrambled after her like ducklings chasing an angry mother goose. The officers turned to me. "Sorry about that," one of them said. "We've had calls from her before." I nodded. "I figured." He handed me a card. "If she steps foot on your land again, call us." I smiled. "Oh," I said, watching Karen throw her arms in the air as she yelled at her board members, her face glowing red in the cruiser lights. "She will." After the police left and the flashing lights faded into the night, the world went strangely, unnervingly quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just that heavy, loaded silence you get before a storm hits. Karen had retreated, but not defeated. I knew that look on her face when she left, the wide-eyed, vein-throbbing fury of someone whose worldview had just been shattered by legal reality. And Karen wasn't the type to accept reality. She was the type to argue with it, rewrite it, and weaponize office supplies until the universe bent to her will. It started the next morning. I stepped outside and found a message taped to my gate. Big block letters in angry red marker. "Remove the sign." The sign wasn't going anywhere. By noon, another paper appeared. "This land is RIDGEVIW property." I laughed at that one. By evening, a third note was slapped onto the fence. "You will be FINED. Fined." By who? The HOA. The same HOA that legally had the jurisdictional range of a napkin. The next day things escalated. I found what looked like official violation notices stuffed under my door, except they were written on cheap printer paper with the Ridgeview logo pixelated like someone screenshot it from a blurry thumbnail. They listed infractions such as unauthorized land possession, non-compliant attitude, and my personal favorite, failure to recognize HOA authority. They even assigned me a fine of $450 for disrespect. I hadn't seen that one in any legal code. The best part, each notice was signed by the HOA board, but the signatures were obviously the same handwriting, just written in different slanted angles like someone thought that would fool me. Karen's work, no doubt. Then the cars started showing up. At first it was one SUV parked suspiciously close to my driveway, then a second, then a third. They weren't blocking me completely, but it was clear what they were doing. They wanted me to know I was being watched. HOA surveillance. Neighborhood intimidation. The Ridgeview Patrol, now consisting of bored retirees with nothing but free time and binoculars. One of them even bought an orange vest so he could stand next to the road like he was directing traffic that didn't exist. Every time I stepped outside, they whipped their heads toward me like synchronized owls. I'd wave. They never waved back. Then came the flyers. They weren't delivered to me, they were delivered to everyone else. My neighbors sent me photos. Special emergency HOA meeting, DISCUSSING community threat. The community threat me, a man minding his own land. They described me as non-compliant, potentially dangerous, a threat to neighborhood unity, and the most dramatic phrase of all, a destabilizing influence. I'm not sure how existing on my property destabilized anything, but apparently Ridgeview's stability hung by a thread, and that thread was named Karen. Later that night they held their emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I could hear them from down the road, voices raised, chairs scraping, walkie-talkies buzzing for no reason at all. Someone actually shouted, "He thinks he can ignore us." Another yelled, "We need to take back control." I heard Karen's unmistakably shrill voice screech. "He is setting a dangerous precedent. If he refuses to obey, others will follow." A few people clapped. A few people sounded uncertain. One poor guy tried to speak up, "But isn't he technically not?" before Karen cut him off with, "Do not question the board." The meeting went on for over an hour. They argued, plotted, whispered, yelled, and at one point chanted something I couldn't quite make out but sounded suspiciously cult-like. When they finally dispersed, Karen strutted out first, clutching her clipboard like it was some prophetic tablet from the heavens. Behind her, the board members nodded solemnly, whispering like generals planning a war strategy. As they walked past, Karen spotted me standing in my yard. Her eyes narrowed into slits. She smirked, not a normal smirk, but the dangerous kind a villain does before saying, "Release the hounds." She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The next morning I found more messages at my gate. Longer, angrier, desperate. "You cannot ignore the HOA. We will win. You are lying about your property. Obey." They even tried to tape a flyer to my dog, who ate half of it before I could pull it out of his mouth. The intimidation didn't scare me, but something was very clear now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion over maps. This wasn't a mistaken belief about boundaries. This wasn't even simple Karen-level delusion anymore. They weren't being misinformed. They weren't guessing. They weren't confused neighbors trying to do the right thing. They were focused, coordinated, driven. They were out for revenge, not because I broke any rule, but because I dared to defy them. They weren't just mistaken. They were obsessed. The moment I realized the HOA had crossed from annoying to obsessed, something in me shifted. This wasn't something I could ignore anymore. They weren't just dropping notes or throwing tantrums. They were actively trying to claim my land, intimidate me, and rewrite reality. So I decided to fight back. Not with drama, not with shouting, not with walkie-talkies or neon flags, with facts, with law, with undeniable proof. First, I contacted a land surveyor. Not just any surveyor, one of the best in the county, a guy who had been marking property lines since before Ridgeview was even a collection of overpriced homes with matching mailboxes. He arrived with equipment that looked like it came straight out of a science fiction movie: tripods, sensors, GPS units accurate down to the inch. While HOA board members used dollar store flags and guesswork, this man used satellite data. He walked the perimeter of my land, scanning, checking coordinates, marking official points with steel stakes. He even pulled archived maps from the county database showing the original boundaries from 50 years ago. Every single map told the same story. My land stopped exactly where the creek ran. The HOA's reach didn't extend a single inch beyond it. When he finished, he handed me a printed, signed, professionally sealed survey report, the kind of document that could end an argument instantly. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said. "You're completely outside their jurisdiction." I thanked him, paid him, and then made my next call. A real estate lawyer, not a basic lawyer. A sharp, calm, ruthless land rights lawyer who had eaten dozens of HOA boards for breakfast. When I told her the story, she raised one eyebrow, then leaned back in her chair with the slow smile of someone who just found out tomorrow's court battle was going to be fun. "They're harassing you," she said plainly. "They're trespassing. They're issuing fraudulent documents. They're attempting to claim land they do not own. And depending on what they've said or threatened, there may even be grounds for civil penalties." She tapped her pen against her legal pad. "You understand they're in serious violation, right?" I nodded. "Good," she said, "because this is going to be easy." She asked me for every piece of evidence I had, every note, every fake violation, every flyer, every ridiculous piece of HOA paperwork Karen had shoved under my door. I gave her everything. She read through it with the same mildly amused expression someone might have while reading a bad comedy script. "They really wrote failure to recognize HOA authority," she said. "Yes," she laughed outright. "That's not even a thing." "I know." "And they fined you for disrespect. Multiple times." She shook her head. "This is incredible. They basically handed me a gift." Then she said the words that made me smile. "I'll take it from here." After that, I made one more stop: county zoning. I drove to the county office, walked up to the zoning desk, and explained the entire situation. The woman behind the counter sighed the sigh of someone who had heard the word HOA far too many times in HER Chinese letter. She pulled up the official county map on her computer, enlarged my area, scrolled, zoomed, clicked, and then pointed. "Your land is completely outside the Ridgeview HOA boundary," she said. "It's not even close. They have no jurisdiction, none." "Can they expand?" I asked. "Not without county approval, and they haven't requested anything in years." "So they can't claim my property?" I asked. "No," she said. "They would need county hearings, documentation, approval from several departments, and they'd have to buy the land, which they didn't and can't." She printed me certified copies of the maps, stamped with the official county seal. She printed the zoning designation. She printed the boundary regulations. By the time she finished, I had a stack of government-sealed evidence thicker than a textbook. "If they bother you again," she said, "tell them to contact our office. We'll handle it." I thanked her and left, feeling the kind of satisfaction that only comes from knowing the truth is so heavy it might physically crush someone like Karen. When I got home, I laid everything out on my dining table: the official land survey, the county zoning maps, the certified boundary documents, the original deed, the updated deed, historical maps, legal descriptions, rights of way, easement records. It was more evidence than anyone should ever need. And Karen had not seen a single word of it yet. My lawyer called that evening. "Everything looks clean," she said. "You're completely in the clear. They, on the other hand, are very much not." "What happens now?" I asked. "First," she said, "I send a letter, a very strong, very legally terrifying letter. Second, we document every attempt they make to contact you. Third, depending on how they react, we decide if we file for civil damages." She paused. "But based on the behavior you described, I expect them to react poorly." Poorly, a perfect Karen word. I pictured her reading that letter, her eyes bulging, her nostrils flaring, her walkie-talkie shaking in her hand as she tried to radio her HOA enforcement squad. My lawyer spoke again. "This is going to get messy on their end, and they won't see it coming until it's too late." I smiled, because she was right. Karen had no idea. Their little harassment crusade, the notes, the flags, the fake fines, the intimidation, wasn't just petty. It wasn't just illegal. It was about to explode in their faces. The morning the legal bomb finally dropped, Ridgeview woke up to something it had never experienced before: consequences. Real, documented, lawyer-signed, county-certified consequences. My attorney mailed the cease and desist packet by certified mail, emailed digital copies, and even had a courier hand-deliver an envelope directly to Karen's porch. According to the courier, she snatched it out of his hands like he was delivering a live grenade. Inside were accusations that would make any normal person freeze: trespassing, harassment, fraudulent boundary manipulation, filing knowingly false police reports, attempted land seizure, and threatening behavior toward a private homeowner. But Ridgeview's board, they held an emergency strategy session in Karen's living room where someone suggested burning the letter. Another thought they could vote away the complaint. They truly believed HOA magic overpowered county law. When they ignored the legal notice, they triggered the next step my lawyer had already prepared: a lawsuit that named every board member individually. Not the HOA, them. Their signatures, their actions, their decisions. Suddenly all their big talk about authority evaporated like spilled gasoline on asphalt. Within 72 hours, 3 board members resigned. One wrote a shaky apology email claiming he wasn't aware the HOA didn't actually have jurisdiction. Another tried to blame Karen, saying she convinced them I was lying. A third simply vanished: yard sale sign taken down, mailbox empty, Facebook account deleted. But Karen, she didn't just stay in the fight, she transformed. She arrived at the courthouse in a bright red Power Blazer, dragging a suitcase full of printed HOA bylaws, Google articles, random neighborhood maps, and something that might have been a hand-drawn treasure chart. She slammed her stack onto the judge's bench like she was dropping evidence in a national conspiracy. "Your Honor," she declared, "this land has always been part of Ridgeview. This man forged his deed. He is manipulating local authorities. He is endangering the HOA by refusing compliance." The judge raised an eyebrow so high it might have reached orbit. My lawyer handed him the deed, the county plat maps, the historical property filings, and a notarized affidavit from the original landowner stating that the parcel had never belonged to Ridgeview. Not once. Not ever. Not even in their wildest administrative fantasies. The judge compared my documents to Karen's. Mine formed a clean, chronological legal trail. Hers looked like a child's scrapbook made during a sugar overdose. The judge asked, "Ms. Karen, do you have any actual legal documents?" She puffed up. "These are legal, they're from the HOA." The courtroom went silent. The judge stared at her like she just announced she rewritten gravity. "HOA guidelines," he said flatly, "are not sovereign law." Karen sputtered, arms waving like malfunctioning windshield wipers. But Ridgeview owns the surrounding area, therefore it owns his area." My lawyer smiled like a wolf who had finally smelled dinner. "Your Honor, the HOA boundaries end 2 full acres before my client's fence. This is documented, recorded, filed with the county." Karen screamed, not spoke, not argued, screamed. "Those maps are wrong. The judge leaned back, hands folded. Are you suggesting the county assessor forged documents to deceive Ridgeview HOA? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, then stood frozen in a loop of malfunctioning indignation. The courtroom gallery tried not to laugh, but a few snorts escaped. The judge rubbed his temples. Ms. Karen, unless you have legitimate evidence, I advise you to stop before you undermine your own position further. But Karen had passed the point of no return. She accused the county of corruption, the neighbors of conspiring with me, and at one point claimed the land spiritually belonged to Ridgeview because the community felt connected to it. The judge actually put his head down on the bench. When he finally spoke, it was with the tone of a man reconsidering his life choices. Ms. Karen, please understand that feelings are not legal boundaries. My lawyer asked for sanctions. Karen gasped like he had threatened to set fire to her lawn gnome collection. The judge didn't sanction her, yet, but he did issue a formal warning and told the HOA to cease all contact with me until the case concluded. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "She just lost the entire argument without us even trying." Walking out of the courtroom, I glanced at Karen. She wasn't angry anymore, she was terrified. Not because she was wrong, because she finally realized she couldn't control what she didn't own. And for the first time since she marched onto my land waving bylaws like holy scripture, Karen understood one brutal truth. The law was about to crush everything she thought she ruled. The courtroom felt like the center of the universe that morning, buzzing with whispers and tension so thick it could have been bottled and sold. Every seat was full. Neighbors, ex-board members, curious onlookers, even the local news reporter pretending she wasn't live tweeting the moment. People knew something explosive was about to happen, and at the center of it all, Karen. She stormed through the courtroom doors like a general entering enemy territory, dragging behind her a massive binder that thudded with every step. If the binder had fallen, it would have broken someone's foot. She slapped it onto her table with the confidence of someone who truly believed this stack of evidence would rewrite reality. Meanwhile, my lawyer walked in holding a single sheet of paper with the casual calm of a man carrying a winning lottery ticket. My land deed. Clean. Simple. Legally airtight. Karen shot him a glare like she wished she could set him on fire with HOA-approved laser vision. The judge entered, already looking tired, as if he sensed this trial would test the limits of human patience. He began with the standard announcements, but everyone knew the real moment was coming. When the judge finally gestured for the evidence, Karen leapt up like she'd been waiting her entire life for this performance. She marched her binder forward, pages flapping, dividers labeled things like illegal structures, non-compliant signage, boundary infractions, and my personal favorite, community vibes. The judge opened the binder, flipped through a few pages, raised his brows, then asked, "Is any of this legally verified?" Karen puffed up. "These are official HOA records." The judge sighed the sigh of a man who regretted going to law school. "Ms. Karen, HOA records do not override county property law." She froze, mouth open, binder halfway raised like she'd been caught mid-dance. My lawyer stepped forward with my single-sheet deed. The judge reviewed it for maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds, that was all it took. Then the hammer fell metaphorically at first. "Mr. Hale owns this land," the judge announced in a tone that echoed like thunder rolling across a dead-silent valley. "The HOA has zero legal authority over him. None, not partial, not implied, not historical. Zero." The courtroom gasped. Karen staggered backward as if someone had thrown a bucket of cold legal reality straight into her face. The judge continued, warming up now, like a performer who finally hit the dramatic part of his speech. "Furthermore, continued harassment of Mr. Hale will result in criminal charges. That includes trespassing, false reports, and any further attempts to assert illegal authority over his property." Karen let out a strangled inhale that sounded like she just swallowed a stapler sideways. But the judge wasn't remotely finished. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing with judicial precision. "Additionally," he said slowly, savoring the moment, "the Homeowners Association is ordered to pay damages for trespassing, attempted property interference, and emotional distress caused by harassment." The courtroom erupted in murmurs so loud the bailiff had to yell for silence. Karen looked like her soul didn't just crack. It shattered into 12 perfectly labeled, alphabetized, color-coded sections. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish gasping for bureaucratic oxygen. She tried speaking but only managed a weak, but, Your Honor, the community, the judge cut her off with a single raised hand. Ms. Karen, this court is not interested in community feelings. We deal in facts. And the fact is, this land was never, is not, and will never be part of your HOA. She sank into her seat like someone had removed her batteries. A lawyer packed up the single sheet of paper. His job done, victory secured, opponent destroyed. Karen frantically flipped through her binder as if somewhere, somehow, there existed a magic page that would rewrite the judge's ruling. There was. I looked at her, and for the first time she didn't stare back with anger, authority, or superiority. She stared with something else entirely, fear. Because she finally realized the truth written in law, stamped by the county, enforced by the judge. She had no power over me. Not legally, not territorially, not at all. And the HOA, they were about to pay for every inch they trespassed, every lie they printed, every step they took past my fence. The courtroom doors opened as people rushed out to spread the verdict. It was over, completely, officially, legally over, and Karen knew it. Her empire of complaints had just collapsed right there in front of everyone. The moment the gavel struck and the verdict spread through Ridgeview like wildfire, everything began unraveling for Karen faster than she could print a violation notice. Word traveled door to door, inbox to inbox, group chat to group chat. People who had barely spoken to each other in years suddenly found themselves bonded by a single unifying theme: outrage. Outrage that their HOA dues, money meant for maintenance, repairs, landscaping, community improvements, had been funneled into Karen's personal crusade against a property she didn't own, couldn't control, and had never had legal authority over. The neighborhood simmered with anger. Homeowners gathered on sidewalks, whispering in clusters. Cars slowed as drivers rolled down windows to exchange updates. The HOA Facebook page exploded with comments demanding explanations, refunds, accountability, anything but more of Karen's authoritarian nonsense. For the first time, people began asking the question they'd been too afraid to ask before: how long has she been abusing her power? And the answers came pouring out. Stories of fines issued without cause, letters delivered at midnight, landscaping citations for imaginary weeds, surveillance photos of people's yards, threats of penalties for Christmas lights installed too early. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been affected. I wasn't the first target. I was simply the first person who fought back hard enough to expose her. Once the audit began, the truth spilled out like a burst dam. Thousands of dollars spent on HOA administrative resources that turned out to be Karen's personal printers, her gas receipts, her stationery orders, her off-the-books, uniform allowance for HOA-branded jackets that only she wore. The board panicked. Meetings turned hostile. Accusations flew like arrows. Members who had loyally stood by Karen for years suddenly claimed ignorance. Loyalty evaporated the moment money got involved. Within 2 weeks, the collapse was total. Karen was voted out as HOA president in the most attended meeting Ridgeview had ever seen. Residents didn't even try to hide their satisfaction. 5 board members resigned immediately, claiming they had been misled. Though the residents weren't stupid, they knew those members enjoyed the power just as much as she had. The financial audit grew so serious that the county requested full documentation, and Ridgeview had none. Not one clear spreadsheet. Not one legitimate ledger. It was chaos disguised as authority. And for the first time in Ridgeview's history, the homeowners rose up together, demanding a complete overhaul of the association. They wanted transparency. They wanted honesty. They wanted leaders who didn't treat residents like peasants under a medieval queen. But the biggest shock came quietly, almost silently, because Karen, for the first time in her life, made no announcement, no speech, no threat. She simply disappeared. One night, well after midnight, a neighbor spotted her dragging bags to her car. No lights on, no witnesses, just the sound of plastic wheels scraping across the driveway and the faint clatter of her clipboard bouncing against her hip. She loaded her belongings with the urgency of someone fleeing a burning building, though the flames were of her own making. No farewell letter taped to a door. No final email demanding compliance. No parting rant about HOA rules being violated one last time. She vanished the same way her authority had, quickly, quietly, with no one stepping in to stop her. When the sun rose, the house she once ruled from like a throne was empty. The blinds were drawn. The porch was bare. The mailbox hung open like a forgotten mouth. And just like that, the queen of complaints, the tyrant of Ridgeview, the self-appointed overlord of property boundaries and sign regulations, was gone. Vanished into the dark, leaving behind nothing but a broken HOA, a stack of unpaid legal bills, and a reputation shattered beyond repair. The residents didn't mourn. They didn't wonder where she went. They didn't even gossip for long. They were too relieved to finally breathe again without checking over their shoulder for Corinne in her neon safety vest with a clipboard raised like a weapon. Her downfall wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was simply final. A quiet exit for a woman who had spent years making noise. And maybe, just maybe, that silence was the last HOA violation she would ever commit. For the first time in what felt like ages, my land was finally, completely, blissfully quiet. No footsteps crunching through the grass at dawn. No walkie-talkies hissing behind trees. No little orange flags popping up in the soil like invasive weeds. No board members lurking near my driveway pretending to inspect community easements. And most importantly, no Corinne. The air felt lighter without her constant presence hovering like a storm cloud on the horizon. The birds came back. The deer wandered closer again, no longer scared off by HOA patrols acting like they were tracking fugitives. Even the wind felt different, gentler somehow, as though the land itself was relieved to be left alone. The old warning sign still stood where I first posted it, weathered but victorious, like a veteran who had survived a ridiculous but unforgettable war. Next to it, I hung a new sign, simple and bold: Land of the Free, HOA, not ALLOWED. It wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration that the chaos was over, the nonsense defeated, and the property restored to the life I'd built here. Sometimes I'd sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink behind the ridge, painting the sky orange and gold. In those moments, I'd think back on everything that had happened: the flags, the screaming, the false reports, the courtroom showdown, the dramatic midnight exit. All that noise, all that drama, all that chaos. And it all started because of one small warning sign. A sign I hung in 5 minutes without thinking twice. A sign that clearly said what the HOA refused to accept. This was my land, not theirs. That tiny piece of metal triggered a domino effect that tore down an entire corrupt system, exposed years of abuse, and finally gave the neighborhood a chance to rebuild without fear. Looking out across my open acres, untouched and undeniably mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Real peace. Not the brittle, tentative peace that exists before an HOA patrol sneaks around your fence, but the kind that settles into the soil, the kind that makes the sunset warmer, the kind that reminds you why you chose this place in the first place. The quiet wasn't emptiness. It was victory. And every time I see that new sign hanging proudly beside the old one, I can't help but smile. Because deep down I know one thing for sure. Corinne may be gone, the HOA may be dismantled, and the conflict may be over, but that little warning sign will always be the legend that started everything.